All right, so this is an F11 Chinese emulsion tube, but that doesn't matter because this is basically just how fuel level and air pressure affects an emulsion tube and why it's important to set each individual location for the CFM the Venturi is seeing. So currently we have no airflow, and in the fuel chamber, the very top hole, you see right there, turn that, the very top hole there should be just below the fuel. As your Venturi creates a pressure differential, you will start to see air introduced. This air emulsifies the fuel, pushing it much higher in the chamber and out through into the throttle bore. As it increases in pressure, the fuel level should drop, moving to the second hole. Now you see, if I put both under, all of the holes start bubbling. This is the situation you would have if you have not enough air for the CFM that the Venturi is seeing. It would be pulling in way too much fuel and drowning the holes. And so they would not operate properly. So as the CFM goes up, the top hole would become uncovered and the air pressure would increase, and the second hole should start bubbling. And again, if we had too much, all the holes start bubbling and then you have a rich condition. So we're trying to tune each individual hole for the CFM that Venturi is seeing. That down a little bit. And then again, if you go even higher, then you start to see the crown holes. This would be the very last CFM before you start to run mainly off of the main jet and the air idle bleed. If you see, the bottom holes, no matter how close they get into the top, do not bubble. Those holes are to fill the chamber when you decelerate to let the fuel inside of the Venturi match what's on the outside. Turn it down here. That will give you better fuel control. Now under wide open throttle, I'm sure all of them bubble. Yes. Because at that point, these are no longer your metering air holes. Your air is now metered by your primary air bleed orifice. All right, so here we have a diagram of the basic emulsion tube in like a Weber. We have our air bleed at the top of the emulsion tube, our main jet at the bottom. The outside of the emulsion tube fills up with fuel, but so does the inside of the emulsion tube. This would be to the Venturi. Atmospheric pressure up here, pressure drop through the Venturi, and that's what changes the pressure on the outside of the emulsion tube. Inside the fuel bowl, you have atmospheric pressure.
inside of the emulsion tube. Above the fuel, you have atmospheric pressure regulated by your air bleed under wide open throttle. As the pressure drops through your venturi, it will lower the pressure inside the emulsion tube chamber, lower than the atmosphere in the fuel chamber. This will actually cause the fuel to rise. It will then overcome the offset of the hole, lifting the fuel above the emulsion tube hole. This also creates a pressure drop from inside the emulsion tube to outside the emulsion tube. The air will begin to flow out of the emulsion tube and emulsify the fuel as it goes out into the venturi. As the venturi pressure, as the CFM through the venturi increases, the pressure drop becomes greater. Now, the trick to tuning these is you're trying to adjust your air-fuel ratio by how much air versus fuel is going through the tube. Now, this is fed from the air differential between inside the tube and the chamber, and that is adjusted by how many holes you have in your emulsion tube. If you have one hole, it may overcome the hole, and like you saw in the video, more holes will start to flow because the fluid inside the emulsion tube will be pushed out, because this is the smaller diameter, so it takes a lot less pressure to push it out. If you have enough holes at your set CFM, so you have, say, 300, or not 300, say 30 CFM going through this, it's gonna have a set amount of pressure it drops. And that is what you try to tune this hole for. Not necessarily 30, that's just an arbitrary number I'm picking. Now this hole is going to have a range. As the fuel comes up, the range is going to be dictated by the internal level of the chamber, or of the emulsion tube. As the CFM increases, the pressure differential between these two and this increases, providing more fuel and lowering the fuel level. So you will have a slight rich increase between this hole and this hole. So as this is transferring down to the secondary hole, you're going to have a slight enriching happen between the two holes. Once this level drops to the point where this hole is, it will emulsify and push everything above it out, clearing this hole. And you might have a little bounce in back and forth, but you are now primarily off of this hole. This continues all the way down to the third hole. This is how you're tuning your emulsification tubes. If you're getting down to the very bottom hole, this hole here is to allow fuel in, so when you're letting off throttle, it fills back up with fuel and closes off these circuits for the air and helps this regulate pressure. Once you get down to here, once you run out of holes, there's no more adjustments you can make, and you're going to be running off of your air bleed diameter and your main jet diameter. So these should be set as if this doesn't exist. you only have enough airflow regulated by your air bleed. You may run out of air bleed by the second hole, meaning this hole is not helping you tune your carburetor. This hole is only functional at wide open throttle and really doesn't do anything for you, because it doesn't matter how many holes you have in this if that doesn't flow enough. So that is the limiting factor to how well you can tune these. You only have this much air for this much jet. Once you reach the maximum amount of air to jet ratio, it doesn't matter how many holes you have. So you have a limited amount you can put in. So you gotta plan it out wisely. So you don't want to just tune it per 100 RPMs. You know, you could if you had a big enough tube and a big enough air inlet and a big enough jet and enough CFM to pull all of that out. But you don't. That would be ridiculous. You usually have about 3 to 4, sometimes 5 holes to do this with. Now on Hollies, they have a totally separate circuit and it's not metered the same way. They're strictly just air holes and the fuel level changes in the chamber. I don't believe there's any fuel inside, and if it is, it's backflowing through the lower jets. Which this could too, like maybe once you get down here, you might see a little change in fuel ratio due to the smaller lower hole. But it's, like I said, by the time you pass this, you're probably out of air here. So how do you tune this? Well, you know you want to set the RPM range for each set of holes. You could divide your max RPM by 4, because you have 4, you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you're wanting to do your first jet from 9 to 1500. I guess you could start your RPM range at the 900 and then the numbers would change, obviously. This is just an example. Well, how do you know that the air you're getting is from just this hole and it's not being overpowered and the fuel level is dropping and you're just sucking out of the lower holes? Because there's no way to visibly see this happening. You have to block off all of the lower holes and tune one hole from the top down. Starting with the first hole, you go to your selected RPM range for that hole. Start with one hole. Start the car, give it the condition you want this hole to operate in the RPM range, and watch your air-fuel ratios. If it's immediately rich, add more holes. Now, why does it go rich? Well, because the main jet and the pressure differential between the two will overpower the hole. And then you're just getting more fuel, less air. And this hole is smaller than this hole, by far. So to reach your intended goal RPM, your high RPM through this hole, you need to add more holes. Once you're satisfied with the amount of holes in this, now you shouldn't go too crazy with how much RPM you're trying to get out of this hole, because that's going to limit how far down the emulsion tube you can go and how many sets of holes down the emulsion tube you can go. Once you're satisfied with that, you can unblock the next hole and tune the next RPM range. So you'll be running off of this hole because you know it flows enough to do your desired RPM range. Once you reach the next RPM range, it will start pulling air out of this hole, leaning the condition and preventing that rich condition that you saw originally. And then you're repeating the process. You're bringing that RPM range in the hole 2 to your next arbitrary RPM range that you think you can get out of this hole without running out of air up here. You put as many holes as you think you need, starting with 1, just slowly add 1 at a time until you can achieve the RPM, the CFM through the venturi that you're wanting this hole to control. Again, repeat process, unplug this hole, repeat process here. This hole you don't really have to worry about because that's going to be under wide open throttle. So really the only way to tune it is to make sure you're not taking air from anywhere else but the hole you're trying to tune, or the range in the emulsion tube you're trying to tune.